International Reports. Around the World with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation.
Hello and welcome to our very first episode of International Reports, the podcast of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, where we bring you fascinating on-the-ground insights from fast-changing regions around the world. Today, we're going to focus on the unfolding events in the South China Sea. Now, this is one of those topics that a lot of people have heard about, but struggle to understand the details of what's actually going on, especially with everything that's happening in Ukraine, in Gaza, and now with Donald Trump in the United States. The South China Sea issue often gets lost, which is precisely why we want to focus on it today. In fact, it's the cover story in the April-May print edition of International Reports, Flashpoint in the South China Sea, how the Philippines and Vietnam are taking a stand against China. And as the headline suggests, we're going to look at the story from two very distinct perspectives to better understand how Vietnam and the Philippines are responding in radically different ways to Chinese territorial claims in the South China Sea. Earlier, I had a chance to speak with the two authors of the report, Daniela Braun in Manila and Florian Feyerabend in Hanoi. Daniela, Florian, thank you both for joining us on this, the first episode of International Reports. It's wonderful to have you both with us.
Pleasure being with you.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, the timing of your article on the question of the South China Sea really couldn't be better given the fact that this is a flashpoint now that everybody's starting to pay attention to, particularly because earlier this year we had the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who was out. There's a lot of questions now about the Trump administration's policies in this part of the world. So you elaborating on all of this really couldn't be better in terms of the timing. Daniela, let's talk to you first, because we want to get to the central question that you raise in the article about what you guys write, China's aggressive and unlawful conduct and how smaller nations can stand up to what you described as an overwhelming opponent. Before we get into the answers on that question, I think we have to do a little bit of background on how we got here. And you say that this is a conflict and a standoff that started back in the mid-1990s. Let's start with you, and then Florian, will come to you about Vietnam shortly.
Yeah, thank you so much for the interest also in the South China Sea and the role the Philippines and Vietnam are playing in all of this. I think international attention to this conflict is also very much welcome, so I'm happy to be here. Yeah, as you mentioned, the South China Sea has long been a geopolitical flashpoint. Since many years, we have these overlapping claims from various coastal states of the South China Sea when it comes to these reefs, islands, maritime zones. And China is claiming more than 90% of the South China Sea and has adopted a very aggressive behavior in the waters also of the other coastal states, building up artificial islands, very aggressively harassing ships of the other coastal states. So yeah, this is not entirely new. You mentioned the mid-1990s. This was actually when the conflict, so to say, between the Philippines and China started to ramp up more with the occupation of Mischief Reef of China. So this is the date you mentioned, 1995. But there were also a lot of other incidents. I would like to mention 2012 here as well. Scarborough Shoal, another Philippine shoal that was overtaken illegally by China. So these were like the major incidents. But then in the last years and months, tensions are increasing much more or have become much more increased. And this has to do with, again, what I mentioned, that China is very aggressive toward the other coastal states, in particular also the Philippines. So we saw a lot of incidents where Chinese vessels and Philippine vessels clashed. Chinese vessels used, for example, water cannons. They blocked or rammed Philippine boats. And by Philippine boats, I mean the Philippine Coast Guard, but also Navy, and also fishermen, so private fishermen. And yeah, this is basically that the tensions have increased over the course of the last month.
Yeah, so Florian, the way that Daniela laid it out in the Philippines, it's very different playing out in Vietnam and the territorial disputes that the Vietnamese have with the Chinese over what the Vietnamese call the East Vietnam Sea or the South China Sea, as it's more colloquially called. The Vietnamese are taking a very different approach in how they respond to the Chinese. You lay this out in the article and saying that there's multiple strategies that are different. Tell us a little bit about the background, just the way that Daniela did from the Philippines perspective. Tell us a little bit more about the Vietnamese side before we get into the details.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I mean, first of all, I would like to emphasize that the approach that the Chinese are taking towards Vietnam is not that much different from what we are witnessing in the West Philippine Sea. It is a little bit below the radar, so to say, because Vietnam is not publicizing those harassments, but those harassments, especially of fishermen, are basically daily taking place as well in the Vietnamese waters. So the Chinese approach is kind of mirrored in the Vietnamese waters as well. We don't have those public images, and for sure the Vietnamese Navy and Coast Guard is not involved to the same degree as the Philippines Navy and Coast Guard are involved. But when it comes to harassment of fishermen, Vietnamese fishermen, we see a very similar pattern taken by China. When we talk about the South China Sea, or as we call it here in Vietnam, you already mentioned it, we call it the East Sea, so it's always a matter of perspective. Where you're seated, you either call it the West Philippine Sea, or if you're in Hanoi, as I am today, we call it the East Sea. If you're based in China, you call it the South China Sea or the South Sea without China, because everything is related to China anyway as a focal point. And we talk about Spratly Islands. And when it comes to Vietnam, there are actually two groups of islands that are contested. It's the Paracel Islands in the north and the Spratly Islands in the south. In our article, we only focus on the Spratly Islands because for the Paracel Islands, the question of control and contestation of who gets to have the islands is still relevant, but it's kind of, I wouldn't call it solved, but the Chinese occupy all features there. So since 1974, the Chinese took control of the whole Paracel Island archipelago, whereas for the Spratly Islands, it's a little bit more complicated to picture. That's why in our article, we focus on the Spratly Islands rather than the Paracel Islands. The Vietnamese, they have their own experience also dealing violently with the Chinese. In 1988, in May 1988, there was a skirmish at the Johnson South Reef where actually 64 Vietnamese sailors were killed. So this whole narrative of China being such a peaceful neighbor, it's a myth, and it's nothing that only changed in recent years. The Vietnamese have learned a bloody lesson about how to deal with such a big neighbor. And now you ask me about how the Vietnamese are dealing with this harassment by the Chinese side. Harassment that, as I mentioned, is harassment of fishermen, but also, of course, just always bullying the southern neighbor by conducting maritime service in the Vietnamese waters, nearby oil and gas reserves of the Vietnamese, so clearly demonstrating, okay, this is our maritime domain. Vietnam, you better stop drilling or exploring and exploiting your oil and gas reserves here, but also the Vietnamese, they always say the hungry sharks strategy by also attacking fiber optic cables in the Vietnamese waters. And then sometimes you have a very slow internet connection. That is something we witness here in Vietnam. And Vietnam is not using a megaphone diplomacy, as we sometimes hear as a negative connotation to this transparency initiative, but they're rather taking things in their own hand and are reclaiming land, following the Chinese model, doing dredging and landfilling, and building up artificial islands of their own.
Yeah, I think if I recall, it's somewhere around $5 trillion worth of international trade passes through the South China Sea. And it is just an enormous amount of trade that passes through it, and in one of the world's most vital economic regions. So the importance can't be overstated economically. But let's get back to the reactions to how Vietnam and the Philippines are dealing with the tensions with China. China lays its claims for this territory in historical maps. These are claims that are not consistent with current international law. The Chinese also do violate on a regular basis the exclusive economic zones of not just the Philippines and Vietnam, but also Indonesia, Malaysia, other contestants and claimants in the region. But the way that different countries in Southeast Asia are responding varies dramatically. You talked very briefly, you mentioned the word transparency. And this is something that the Philippines has done to some great effect. And you mentioned this in the article, Daniela, something called the Transparency Initiative, where they bring journalists and reporters onto the boat. So when there are interactions, they're uploading videos of those interactions with the Chinese, these confrontations at sea, directly, oftentimes via Starlink satellite connections. And they're on social media within minutes and provoking a lot of outrage internationally and a lot of sympathy for the Philippines. This is the megaphone, I think, Florian, that you talked about, that the Vietnamese choose, wait, we don't want to do that. Even the Philippines have backed off of this in recent months. So Daniela, maybe talk to us a little bit about this transparency initiative and why it worked and maybe why they're not using it quite as much today.
Yeah, this is an approach that was adopted under the current government. The previous government had a very different approach to China, to the US, to the South China Sea and the maritime claims. But under the current government of President Marcos Jr., who is in office since end of June 2022, the Philippines have taken over a different approach. They are much more vocal, much more outspoken about the maritime claims, and they are confronting China and the aggressive and illegal behavior of China in the West Philippines Sea. I just want to mention they still try to engage with China. They have something they call the bilateral consultation mechanism. So this is still going on, but nonetheless, they are much more outspoken. And the central piece of this is the so-called transparency initiative. This is not well written down strategy you can find in official Philippine government papers, but it is an official approach the government has adapted. And yeah, you mentioned it already. They are trying to expose the aggressive behavior of China in the West Philippine Sea. They are bringing journalists on missions, not only Filipino journalists, international journalists. They are releasing a lot of video and photo material from these incidents that I mentioned in the beginning. And this is an approach they are following since approximately March, April 2023. After a major incident when China used a military laser against Filipino boats. So I think this was not the approach immediately in the beginning of the new Marcos government, but it was rather a response to this very, very aggressive incident. In terms of its successes, I think it is a little bit difficult because I mentioned it's not a written down strategy. So we don't know what the major objectives are. But when you talk to Philippine government officials, they always name two major target groups. The first one is their own population. So they want to raise awareness and support for the approach in the West Philippine Sea. And I think in terms of this, they are very successful. We have surveys that the population is very much in favor for this course of the president. This also helps with regards to Chinese disinformation we are seeing here in the Philippines to make the population more resilient because they know what is going on in the West Philippine Sea. And the second main target group is really the international community. And I would also say that the Transparency Initiative is successful in outreaching to the international community in terms of raising also awareness, but also solidarity with the Philippines. So every time we have these incidents, we have a number of embassies who are raising their solidarity with the Philippines. So I think this is very important, but it's not only about raising or mentioning solidarity, it's also about really signing defense agreements. And we see that the Philippines are really building up their security and defense ties with partners like Japan, for example, Australia, but also increasingly with European nations. So France is really interested in signing a reciprocal access agreement, and also Germany and the Philippines are about to sign a bilateral military agreement in May this year, most likely. So I think transparency is also very successful when it comes to really building up security and defense ties with these Western allies and partners. With regards to if it's successful in terms of changing Chinese behavior, I would be much more critical because this idea to really put some burden on the reputation of China in terms of debunking Beijing's picture of itself as a peaceful great power, I think China is willing to accept these reputational costs in order for their maritime claims and their geopolitical targets. So we don't see a major behavior in China when it comes to these gray zone activities in the West Philippine Sea. And this is also backed by data, for example, from the US think tank Center for Strategic and International Studies. They release data about ship movements in the West Philippine Sea, and we see that China has increased the number of ships. And also what what I mentioned in the beginning, that the number of incidents has also become much more frequent and violent. So in terms of Chinese behavior, it's maybe not so successful, but I just want to mention that when you talk to Philippine government officials, they mention it's not a silver bullet, and it's, I think, a very, very big target in order to change really the behavior of China. And I would say that the transparency initiative is really reaction to illegal and aggressive behavior of a very powerful opponent.
Eric, if I may, I would like just to add 2 points to the 2 points that Daniela mentioned. I mean, when Daniela talked about the objectives, even though they are not written down in a strategic document, and therefore it's more educated guessing what are the end goals or objectives of this transparency initiative, she talked about the domestic audience, shoring up nationalism and support for the Filipino claims on the islands. In the case of Vietnam, it's rather the other way around. The reason why we don't see a transparency initiative from the Vietnamese perspective or from the Vietnamese side is to rather tone down the anti-Chinese sentiments that we can find in the population here in Vietnam. There's a very strong feeling, anti-China feeling in the Vietnamese population, and this is also rooted in history, Chinese occupation, and Vietnam is a land country. It's not an archipelago like the Philippines. We have a long land border not far away from Hanoi. I'm looking here at the map on my wall. It's really close, and this of course informs also the strategic thinking here of policy elites in Hanoi, and also of the population. They know that China is a big neighbor that is not separated by a sea. We are sitting and living next to each other. And therefore, the Vietnamese government is rather inclined to tone down the disputes and the public sentiment, the public emotions towards China, because there were incidents in the past, 11 years ago in 2014, when China put an oil rig in the Vietnamese exclusive economic zone, and there was really like a public uproar and violent protest demonstrations. And of course, this is something that the Vietnamese government political elite would not like to see. And the second point I would like to mention is what Daniela called about the international involvement and the military alliance that Philippines are enjoying with the United States, but also the discussions they're currently undergoing with France, as it has been mentioned. This is something very different in Vietnam, because Vietnam is a non-aligned country, and it's the clear policy of Vietnam not to align itself with any country against another country. This is also a lesson that they learned from their own history during the Cold War. And I think those 2 points, they already provide a little bit of an explanation of why the approaches of dealing with China are so different between Manila and Hanoi.
Florian, you made the point earlier that Vietnam is different, that it doesn't have the security partnerships that the Philippines has. But at the same time, over the past, say, 12 to 18 months, the Vietnamese have been on a tear in upgrading diplomatic relations to comprehensive strategic partnership ties with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, with any number of countries. Do you think that this flurry of diplomatic upgrades that they've been doing with countries around the region, and even to some extent, even in India as well, is related to the concerns that they have about their relations with China, or are those two separate tracks?
No, I mean, you're totally right. Of course, this is something that is related to their geostrategic position as a small, comparatively small neighbor at the south of China, right? And also at the South China Sea, therefore. I mean, Vietnam has a coastline of 3,200 kilometers, and all of this is bordering the claims of the 9 or now 10-dash line of China. So, of course, China is the overwhelming topic in the strategic thinking of the Vietnamese policymakers. And you mentioned a couple of countries. You mentioned Japan, you mentioned Australia. And one could add, in recent months, it was like rather focused on Southeast Asia. The upgrades that we witnessed in the first quarter of 2025 was referring to Singapore and Indonesia. Those were the last or the latest 2 additions to this highest tier of strategic partnerships, the so-called comprehensive strategic partnership. One country you forgot to mention is actually the United States. In September 23, then President Joe Biden was visiting Hanoi, and even the United States, a country that only 50 years ago, the Vietnam War, we call it the American War here in Hanoi, and that, of course, the U.S. withdrew already in 1973. But you have to bear that in mind. The U.S. is a former foe and enemy of Vietnam, is now a comprehensive strategic partner. And this is, of course, due to the calculations that the Vietnamese conduct under their strategy of bamboo diplomacy, where they want to have good ties with everyone, friends to everyone, foe to no one. That is basically how to sum it up. And therefore, there is almost like it's a bit of a, you dilute the value of comprehensive strategic partnerships. That's my personal opinion. If you have so many comprehensive strategic partners, but of course it's something that is increasing the international standing of Vietnam, and that is of course also increasing the value of Vietnam with a couple of international players that are relevant. You also mentioned India, of course. The role of India is something that we have to watch closer in the coming years. The role of India in Southeast Asia as a counterweight and or a hedge towards China.
And you mentioned Joe Biden visiting when he was president, and Vietnam has the distinction of being the only country in the world that got visits in the same calendar year or 12-month period from Joe Biden, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping. That is quite notable there. A lot of people look to the region and say, okay, we've had this dispute. It's been going on, as Daniela pointed out, since the 90s. While Southeast Asia and Asia lack the mechanisms that you have in Europe, for example, like NATO or the European Union or any number of these multilateral institutions, there is one that's out here, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Daniela, you mentioned in the article, though, that ASEAN really has not been very effective at mediating this dispute. Why not? I think that's an obvious question for a lot of people.
Yeah, in many of the member states, China plays a very crucial role. So I think China rather likes to deal with these nations bilaterally, like it does also with the European Union and other organizations. So China is very influential. And then they also have to agree all. So that's also very difficult.
It's consensus-based.
Yeah, it's consensus-based, so it's very difficult to come to conclusions. So I think these are the two major reasons. There are still these negotiations going on concerning a code of conduct in the South China Sea. This is with ASEAN and China. But as we mentioned in the article, to be honest, I think there is not much hope in any of these member states, although they are still doing this negotiations, which might be a good exercise to do in order to build up trust and so on. But I would not put too much hope on the end result that there will be an effective code of conduct that will help sort out these conflicts. So that's just the reason why ASEAN is not like a very effective organization.
Yeah, so Florian, if ASEAN is not going to be the forum that you can discuss this in a multilateral setting, then countries like Vietnam are forced to basically go on their own, right?
Exactly, and that's what Vietnam has been doing in the last 4 to 5 years. But let me just add 2 points to ASEAN. I think it's very important for our audience also to maybe reiterate that there's a so-called ASEAN way, and that's referring to how ASEAN is doing or is conducting the decision-making process, and that is by consensus. And if we look at ASEAN now, currently 10 countries, soon to be 11 countries, they're very different. They're very different in terms of their geographic position on the map. They're the so-called maritime Southeast Asian countries. They're the land-based Southeast Asian countries that are not archipelagic. There are monarchies. There are communist states such as Laos and Vietnam. There are small countries such as Brunei or Laos. There are countries with huge populations, where I would also include with Vietnam, with now more than 100 million inhabitants, and of course, for sure, the Philippines. So the interests are very different as well. I mean, only 4 out of the 10 Southeast Asian member states of ASEAN have territorial disputes in the maritime domain with China in the South China Sea. If we include Indonesia with the Natuna Sea, okay, 5. But that is only half. The other 5 countries that are saying, okay, this is not our problem. And we could see that in the past, taken together with a decision-making process, which is based on consensus, right? Where we couldn't agree on resolutions condemning or rejecting the Chinese assertive claims in the South China Sea, where, for example, a country such as Cambodia, that is not having any territorial disputes with China, but very reliant economically on the support and the economic exchange with China, blocked basically the decision-making and the condemnation of Chinese behavior in the South China Sea. So I think this is very important. We should not think that ASEAN, even though sometimes we talk about the ASEAN centrality, is a homogeneous bloc and where countries have the same shared interests. Those countries here in the region, they have very different interests and they have very different geostrategic positions on the map. And therefore, taking into account the decision-making process based on consensus, it is really an illusion to believe that ASEAN can step up and be a counterweight to the Chinese claims in the South China Sea. Now you ask about, okay, how is Vietnam dealing with it? Because Vietnam is on its own, right? So Vietnam is also using the element of international law. Daniela talked about the Transparency Initiative, where we want to create images that basically highlight that China is violating international law. Vietnam is using that in a different way. I mean, Vietnam is hosting a lot of conferences on UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, where we talk about UNCLOS and where they let other voices be heard that are then criticizing the Chinese behavior. It is not so much Vietnam itself stepping forward, but letting others speak on their behalf. Let's call it like that. That is basically the prime approach. Last year, for the very first time, Vietnam nominated a candidate to become a judge at the International Law of the Seas in Hamburg. That is basically the court that is connected to UNCLOS. That shows also that Vietnam is taking the rules-based order very serious, and even more so during a Trump 2.0 administration. And of course, the main point that you probably are alluding to is like the Vietnamese approach to building and reclaiming land. And probably, I mean, this is more like an educated guess because we do not really know that yet. The satellite images just indicate that there's an increasing land reclamation effort going on in the South China Sea. But we could expect that probably this will be also fortified, that there might be anti-ship missiles installed in the near future. We can already see that 8 new harbors were created over the course of the last 5 years. So now, prior to 2021, Vietnam had only 4 harbors in the South China Sea on the different rocks and reefs and islands there. Now we're standing at the number 12. So that shows that Vietnam is taking it very serious. We had only 1 landing strip, 1 airport prior to 2021. Now we have a second landing strip that is significantly longer, twice the length of the previous existing one. That means Vietnam also has the capability now to deploy a bigger aircraft to the South China Sea. So this shows that Vietnam is trying to take things in its own hand and trying to step up its defense capabilities in the South China Sea.
It's just ironic that you point out that the Vietnamese are much more engaged in land reclamation, expanding their territorial footprint in the South China Sea, and the Philippines are not in any expansionist mode, just trying to hold on to territory that they believe that's theirs. The irony here, of course, is that the Chinese seem to be much more aggressive with the Philippines in their approach, even though that the Philippines are just trying to hold the line. And yet the Vietnamese are literally expanding their footprint in the South China Sea and provoking very different reactions from the Chinese. Why do you think that is? Because there seems to be 2 very different stories unfolding here. We're going to start wrapping up and just trying to get people to see the bigger picture. But Daniela, help us understand how these 2 countries provoke such different responses from China.
I think there are probably 2 or many more factors, but maybe let's name 2 very briefly. So the Philippines are a treaty ally of the US, so we also have to see the bigger picture that we talk about great power rivalry. The Philippines are part of the first island chain, so very important geostrategic locations. So I think the Philippines are becoming a piece in this great power play between China and the US. So I think, and this is also how China is always framing it, that the Philippines is a puppet of the US, that the US is using now these Philippine military bases. This is always a Chinese narrative, that the Philippines don't have agency in this, that it's not their national interest, but that they are used by the US, which is, of course, not the case, because it is about Philippine national interest in the West Philippine Sea, but this is also the Chinese narrative. So I think this is more like for China about also the bigger picture, and the Philippines being the oldest US treaty ally in Asia is definitely a very big argument in this. And the second point, and this is what Florian can much better elaborate on, is that Vietnam is a very different political system, very much closer to China. So I think they have also very different channels and they're doing things much differently. But I think Florian is much more knowledgeable to talk about.
Okay, Florian, we've set you up on that one quite well. Go ahead and tell us why.
No, I think I can just reiterate the points that Daniela made. I think the point about the treaty alliance with the United States, I think that is very important. And the lens that China is applying to look at conflicts in the South China Sea. When they look at the Philippines, they see, I think Daniela called it the pawn or the proxy, right? I mean, they see the Philippines maybe not acting autonomously, but maybe on behalf of the US or together in conjunction with the United States. And therefore, they have this prism of geopolitical competition. When it comes to Vietnam, they see that Vietnam is a non-aligned country. Vietnam does not allow access to military bases on its territory. So therefore, they do not see this geopolitical threat coming from Vietnam or Vietnamese claims, and also therefore land reclamation efforts. The party-to-party ties between the 2 communist parties, I think, is a very important element, because when we talk about the different reactions, we have to say a lot of the things that we see. This is one thing, but there are a lot of things that are probably not seen, that are behind the curtain, behind the veil. And this is the party-to-party communication, the dialogue channels that are existing there. So we do not really know if there is no strong rejection from the Chinese side. I mean, there was only one statement in February this year by the spokesperson of the Foreign Ministry of China, but we could assume that probably due to the party-to-party ties, that there's a clear communication, probably also condemnation from the Chinese side regarding this land reclamation efforts, that there's probably a lot of things that are going on behind the veil that we are just not seeing. Yeah, that could be the case, right? I mean,
don't forget, we saw live fire naval exercises by the Chinese in the Gulf of Tonkin right above their line. So the Chinese are not entirely silent on the Vietnamese side either. So that was quite a statement that they said. You closed your article looking at what Germany should do, and I'd like to close our discussion looking at Germany as well. You know, this is a difficult time for the Sino-German relationship right now because Germany is facing a lot of economic pressures in Europe. It's facing a lot of economic pressures from the fact that its auto industry is under enormous pressure, particularly with Chinese vehicles now coming into the European Union market, some under tariff, some not. And so we're at a very delicate time in the Sino-German relationship. You're advocating for Germany to really support Vietnam and Philippine claims in the South China Sea. And I guess if I'm in the German Foreign Ministry advising the Chancellor, trying to think about the relationship as a whole, do you think that this part of the relationship is worth potentially upsetting the broader China-German relationship, given the sensitivity that this is for China? Is this worth it? So just asking you to defend that last point that you made in the article about why Germany should really support the Philippines and Vietnam in these claims.
Interesting take. I would have thought you would raise the pressure more, Europe spending more on defense for the own continent.
That too, by the way. No, but that too.
So this is always the argument I keep hearing. What role can Germany or Europe still play in the Indo-Pacific with everything what's going on in the Euro-Atlantic theater, so to say?
It's a legitimate question, I think.
Yeah, interesting that you brought in the German-Sino relationship. But yeah, I mentioned already that Germany and the Philippines are about to sign a military agreement. I think it's also about German and European interest, what we elaborated in the beginning about the bigger picture, the rules-based international order, which is in the interest of a smaller or medium-sized nations like Germany to really defend these rules, particularly for countries who are not militarily that capable right now. I mean, we are working on that. So I think we also raised expectations in the Indo-Pacific with our Indo-Pacific guidelines. We had 2 Indo-Pacific deployments. We sailed the Strait of the Taiwan Strait last time with our Indo-Pacific deployment in September last year. So we sent out some very important signals already and raised some expectations. And I think we still have to play a role in the Indo-Pacific, even though everyone understands that the pressure is also increasing in Europe. So we won't play the big military role in the Indo-Pacific. But for example, mentioning this military deal between Germany and the Philippines, it will be a lot about training, for example, also training in terms of the Philippine Coast Guard, military domain awareness. So I think there is definitely a role to play for us, given or even though the larger geopolitical picture you mentioned. So I would still advise the new German Chancellor to still play a role in the Indo-Pacific because it's really about also our interest and also economic interest and trade interest, what we've mentioned in the beginning. But yeah, I will give also some room also for Florian too.
Okay, Florian, you have the last word today in the program. Go ahead.
Just maybe 3 points. I mean, the first point would be that Germany is not supporting any claims. Germany doesn't take any stance on which reef and which rock is owned by which country or belongs to which country. We just talk about the upholdings of the international law of the sea. And that is about contiguous maritime zones. And therefore, we do not talk about if the Chinese or the Vietnamese are right to possess this or that island. Germany is not taking a stand on that. It's about international law, and in this case, the international law of the sea. This brings me to my second point. Germany is a middle power and we are a trading power. Therefore, we are super reliant on international maritime trade and not a domination of certain sea lanes of communication by individual countries, hegemons in the region that can then maybe also jeopardize our international trade. Therefore, it's in the core interest and the national interest of Germany that we uphold the international law of the sea in the South China Sea in order to secure also our own economic model where we are a trading nation that is reliant on maritime shipping routes. And the third point is I think Germany as a middle power that is so reliant on international trade has to step even up a bit more in times where international law is under pressure. I think this is in our own interest that if other countries such as the United States you mentioned before is maybe saying, okay, international law is not so relevant anymore, we have to speak even louder. And maybe allow me one sentence. I think for sure Europe and Germany, we are not security providers in the region, but it's also about commonalities with the United States when it comes to the outlook on China and the risk perception of China. I think here we can demonstrate that we have a shared interest as well in the Indo-Pacific, because both the United States and in Europe see the challenges that come with assertive Chinese behavior in the region. And I think this is probably also a good chance for us to demonstrate and underline commonalities in areas where we can still work together with not too much friction, even though, of course, our positions are not 100% overlapping as well.
The article is Flashpoint in the South China Sea, how the Philippines and Vietnam are taking a stand against China. It's in the April-May edition of International Reports. We'll have a link to that in the show notes, and it was written by Daniela Braun, who's the head of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation Philippines office, and Florian Feyerabend, who is the resident representative and head of the office in Vietnam. Florian, Daniela, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Congratulations on the article. It was excellent, and we're looking forward to having you back again on International Reports.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eric.
Well, that'll do it for this inaugural episode of International Reports. Make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to share your comments as we're just getting started and would love to hear your feedback. So for everyone at the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back soon with another episode of International Reports. Until then, bye for now.